He clave the rocks in the wilderness, and gave them drink as out of the great depths. He brought streams also out of the rock, and caused waters to run down like rivers. And they sinned yet more against him by provoking the Most High in the wilderness. And they tempted God in their heart by asking meat for their lust. Yea, they spake against God. They said, Can God furnish a table in the wilderness? Behold, he smote the rock, that the waters gushed out, and the streams overflowed. Can he give bread also? Can he provide flesh for his people? Therefore the Lord heard this, and was wroth, so a fire was kindled against Jacob, and anger also came up against Israel. Because they believed not in God, and trusted not in his salvation, though he had commanded the clouds from above, and opened the doors of heaven, and had rained down manna upon them to eat, and had given them of the corn of heaven. Man did eat angels' food, he sent them meat to the full. Note how verse 15 misled the commentators when they tried to handle Psalm chapter 74 verse 15. The constant interchasing of the depths of the Red Sea with the great deep of Genesis chapter 7 verse 11. Verse 16 shows that there was no trickling of water out of one boulder when Moses went to work. Whatever he did with his rod, it had to slake the thirst of over 5,000 plus cattle. What was needed were rivers, verse 16. That they came is beyond question. For look 2 Kings chapter 3 verse 17 and 20. The fire of verse 21 is literal. See Numbers chapter 16 verse 35 and Leviticus chapter 10 verse 2. And had rained down manna, the corn of heaven. Man did eat angels' food, verses 24 and 25. Observe that it can rain, water, hail, fire, or bread. The word rain is a verb, not a noun. We are told that the angels' food is the bread of the mighty ones, but nothing further develops. Many forget old Leviathan, Psalm chapter 74 verse 14, whose wounded head will feed someone in the wilderness. This feeding in the wilderness is mentioned 4 times in the Gospels, which is more times than the virgin birth, the ascension, the prodigal son, the good Samaritan, the rich man and Lazarus, the Sermon on the Mount, the Lord's Prayer, or the raising of Lazarus. The food here can be food for angels or food from angels. It probably is from instead of for. But an angel certainly can eat food. They do in Genesis chapter 18 verse 8, and they do in Genesis chapter 19 verse 3. When Christ comes up from the dead, he eats food. Luke chapter 24 verse 43. The events of verses 20 to 25 will all take place again Revelation chapter 12 verse 14, Micah chapter 7 verse 14. And that is why Satan tempted Christ to produce bread in the wilderness. Luke chapter 4 verses 3 to 4. All 3 of the temptations were connected with Bible commands that will fulfill biblical prophecies. Satan is in some way connected with this manna. It can breed worms, and Christ denies that it's the true bread. John chapter 6 verse 32. Since it's round and white, the word picked up the truth without knowing it and called their round white cake angel's food cake, so called. It's the corn of heaven in distinction from the corn of the land, found in Joshua chapter 5 verse 11. It's connected with the north because it comes from snow and hail. See Job chapter 38 verse 22 and Isaiah chapter 55 verse 10. It's connected in some dark way with snowflakes. The word itself, flakes, appears 1 time in the Bible. It's connected with Leviathan, Job chapter 41 verse 33. He caused an east wind to blow in the heaven, and by his power he brought in the south wind. He rained flesh also upon them as dust, and feathered fowls like as the sand of the sea. And he let it fall in the midst of their camp, round about their habitations. So they did eat and were well filled, for he gave them their own desire. They were not estranged from their lust, but while their meat was yet in their mouths, the wrath of God came upon them, and slew the fattest of them, and smote down the chosen men of Israel. For all this they sinned still, and believed not for his wondrous works. For he gave them their own desire. Is the old story of Jeremiah chapter 6 verse 19. The worst thing God can do to any man is to let him have his own way. The fatal is every time, for man is not what he thinks, he is the measure of all things, and his natural course is downward, usually at breakneck speed. Some might think that they have a flesh of arm, doing everything and helping everything. All dispensations end in apostasy, including the millennial reign of Christ. The New Age movement is a joke, a genuine farce. There is nothing new about it. It's just atheism disguised as progress. It's simply old, unregenerate Adamic flesh parading as deity. Your own desire can lead you many kind of troubles, whatever it is, pornography, alcohol, drugs, or idolizing or worshipping something in this world, even yourself. If you desire a modern Bible that you can understand easily, Satan will give you one. No man naturally desires carrying a cross. No man naturally desires giving up the world. No man naturally desires going against the current of his day and time. No Adamic man would think of putting Jesus Christ ahead of his own flesh and blood. Luke chapter 14 verse 26. No man enjoys self-denial. Romans chapter 8 verse 13. And no man likes to live entirely by faith, going right all the time, doing right all the time, with no visible proof that he will be rewarded. When God gave them their own desire, he gave them sickness and death with it. Compare Psalm chapter 78 verses 30-31 with Numbers chapter 11 verse 33. For all this sickness and death, they sinned still, just like Pharaoh did even after Israel had left. Exodus chapter 14 verse 4-6. Man is incurably wicked. Jeremiah chapter 17 verse 9. Christ called his own disciples evil. Matthew chapter 7 verse 11, without even investigating their lives or their moral condition. Therefore their days did he consume in vanity, and their years in trouble. When he slew them, then they sought him, and they returned and inquired early after God. And they remembered that God was their rock, and the high God their Redeemer. Nevertheless they did flatter him with their mouth, and they lied unto him with their tongues. For their heart wasn't right with him, neither were they steadfast in his covenant. But he, being full of compassion, forgave their iniquity, and destroyed them not. Yea, many a time turned he his anger away, and didn't stir up all his wrath. For he remembered that they were but flesh, a wind that passed away and cometh not again. It's good to remember that human life, it's like wind that passed away and not cometh again. That easily forgotten in the busyness of life. When he slew them, then they sought him, as in Numbers chapter 21 verse 7 and Judges chapter 10 verses 9-10. They remembered verse 35 at times. Nevertheless they did flatter him with their mouth. See in Joshua chapter 24 verse 24 and Ezekiel chapter 33 verses 30 to 33. Lip service as in Mark chapter 7 verse 6 in New Testament times. The trouble is heart trouble, for their heart wasn't right with him. The issues of lives come from the heart. They lied unto him with their tongues, like Ananias and Sapphira, Acts chapter 5 verse 4. The flattery is illustrated in Jeremiah chapter 42 verse 5 in no uncertain terms. Zedekiah does it even before that, Jeremiah chapter 38. But he, being full of compassion, forgave their iniquity. Note the tremendous difference in the way sinners are saved under the law and the way they are saved now under grace. Didn't stir up all his wrath. He just stirred up a little bit to the tune of several 100,000 deaths. Hebrews chapter 3 verse 11, 17 and 1 Corinthians chapter 10 verse 5 and 8. Numbers chapter 16 verse 49 also. If God had vented his full wrath on Israel, Exodus chapter 32 verse 9 to 11, Moses would have had to start all over again and beget 12 tribes to fulfill the promises given to Abraham, Isaac and Jacob. Fortunately, Moses and God never got in the killing mood at the same time. Verse 39 is self-explanatory.